well, didn't see you there. Well, my name is Kody Grant. I'd like to thank you for joining us today and taking your time to sit down and chat with me. I've been working for the foundation full-time for about 5, going on 6 years, I suppose. But prior to that, I've been working as a contractor for Colonial Williamsburg during the spring and during the fall for about 6 years prior to that. So I've been kind of coming up here since I was about 20 or 21 and doing work for them. So originally started coming in doing programs like So Far From Soto, and then moved on to War Party, and then we were able to do a program called Beloved Woman, where we had some folks from down home in the Eastern Band Cherokee come on up and do programming with us, and one of the biggest scripted live programs, I guess you can kind of say. But more recently, as of late, with full-time staff coming on board here at Colonial Williamsburg, we've been able to push more daily programming available for gifts and things like that. So, for example, a lot of our programming that we have coming up for this year is things like our American Indian Life Series, where we take a aspect of Native American or American Indian life from the 18th century and kind of open that up, talking about the Shawnee hostages who were brought here to Williamsburg to stay at the palace with Lord Dunmore at the conclusion of Dunmore's War. And then, of course, our delegation area over at the magazine. So for a lot of our guests who come here, I'm pretty sure you all are very familiar with that and what we do there. That's basically what we're trying to build on with this live chat right here. So our main goal here with the American Indian Initiative at Colonial Williamsburg is to give people the opportunity to meet with folks who come from these various different American Indian communities in the United States, and kind of how they're focusing on their historical life and aspects, and how we can relate that to our contemporary standing, right? So we know Native Americans or American Indians are not people of the past. They are contemporary people. And just like Colonial Williamsburg, looking back at where we came from, where it all started, that's exactly the same thing that we're doing. So we're looking at kind of our own culture, our own communities, but also focusing on that shared history of where did all these different tribes, where did all these different people fit in that story, right? So we're all part of that same kind of identity. And so this is the ability to kind of give you that same notion of what it's like if you were to come visit us. So as you notice, I'm not in character, of course, I'm just speaking as Kody Grant from 2020. But it's the ability to just sit down and ask questions, which we realize a lot of folks today might not have that ability, Originally, I came up here from Cherokee, North Carolina, where I worked with the Cherokee Historical Society at our Okanalefti Indian Village for our outdoor drama, Unto These Hills. But I also had the honor and the privilege of working with the Warriors of Bonnie Gadua, cultural ambassadors for the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. And every time people came to Cherokee, they knew what they were coming for. They knew what to expect. But sometimes we catch folks kind of unawares when they come up here to Colonial Williamsburg and they see a delegation talking about the various different tribes coming here to Williamsburg and what they'd be doing. So we want to give you the opportunity to be able to ask some questions, and hopefully I have an answer to those. If I don't, I'll be more than comfortable to tell you I might not have any answer to that, or I might not be able to speak on that. But hopefully in going back over these questions, we might be able to post something coming on later on to kind of give you a avenue on where to find the answer to those questions, I guess you can kind of say. But honestly, that's a little bit about me and what we do here at Colonial Williamsburg. But I want to go ahead and give you the opportunity to really just ask questions and make the most of our time here and get a little bit of understanding, I guess. Mm-hmm. Sure. So if we have any questions that are ready and available, I'm more than willing to get started.
Sure thing. Chloe would like to know, what do they eat?
Well, we ate food, and a lot of it. But I guess it kind of depends on where you're coming from, right? So here in the Americas, there are a lot of different food that we identify as like Southern food and things like that, especially where I come from. It was just actually derived from a lot of the foods that are indigenous to the Americas and different regions, which folks inhabit. Specifically talking about like down here, for instance, corn is basically main staples: corns, beans, and squash. Which we're growing as agricultural people as our main food stores, but they're also hunting too. So things like deer, elk, and bears and things of that sort. Those different animals are providing that meat to supplement a lot of the vegetables and things that we grow for ourselves. So when Europeans are arriving, we have remarks of folks going into these different Cherokee villages or many of the other southeastern communities like Creeks and Tuscaroras, et cetera, and saying that their farms are massive. They're these massive things, these operations. So they definitely know what to use for food, how to grow it, and how to make use of those things, whether that means eating it pretty quickly or being able to preserve it for use at a later time.
As you were speaking there, you're talking about some of the different tribes, communities, and use the word nation as well. What are the differences between tribe, nation, and the like?
Oh, yeah. So as I'm going on, I'm pretty sure you'll see that I'm going to be using a lot of different words pretty interchangeably, talking about the same things. We're talking about tribes or nations or communities. It's pretty much what you're looking at. They're all kind of the same thing. So when we talk about a tribe, you're talking about a specific group of people with their own culture, their own kind of heritage, religious structures, spiritual beliefs, social practices, etc. But we're really talking about just different nations, different tribes. So if I'm talking about Eastern Band Cherokee Indians, if I'm talking about Sled Pueblo over here in the Southwest, if I'm talking about Eastern Shawnee, etc., all those different tribes are their own separate nations, their own separate communities. So when you talk about like in the 18th century, when we say like Europeans, I'm not speaking about one group of people. It's all these other different nations, right? They each have their own language and customs and things like that, etc. It's the same thing here in the Americas, except we're talking about people who are indigenous to this region.
All right, Ellie would like to know, what did they live in?
Again, it depends on the communities. Of course, thinking about film and TV and things like that, everybody's pretty familiar with the teepees and things like that. That's actually a very small portion of the American Indian population in the United States that actually use those things. So their main food source, of course, being buffalo, thinking about the tribes out in the plains, the Sichongus, Hunkpapas, Kiowas, Cheyennes, etc. A lot of them folks who are kind of traveling around with their main food source being buffalo, they have to be able to follow those herds wherever they go. So the use of teepees and things like that to be able to set them up, make a camp, get your hunting, things like that, and then whenever the herds move, break them down, move on again. But for a lot of tribes, especially on the eastern coast here, you think about like a lot of the local tidewater tribes from around here, like Pamunkeys, etc. A lot of tribes down in the southeast, like some of the ones I mentioned with Cherokees and Creeks, going up north with Six Nations, things like that. A lot of their communities are sedentary, and so they're living in permanent homes, permanent structures. And each community has their own terms for them. Each community has their own means of building those things, using the resources that are available in their area. But they're pretty permanent because everything that they need is within their region. So if they're agricultural people, of course, they're using the land to harvest and grow whatever it is that they need. But when they go hunting, there are hunting grounds. So those are areas where those animals are populated there that those different tribes do not settle or inhabit specifically to keep that constant source of game going. So they never have to leave those places. So that's what you can kind of see in the differences of what they're living in.
Now, we've had multiple questions asking about pandemics and disease. Can you talk about how some of the native peoples had to deal with that?
Yes. So as far as in a lot of things I'm speaking on is pretty much to the extent of my knowledge, not to say that there aren't folks who could speak a little bit more on what pandemics and diseases did within American Indian communities in the 18th century. But one of the things that we can really agree on is we don't have any kind of like stories of large diseases or large pandemics going through our oral history, of course. But we can really take accounting of when Europeans begin to arrive on what those illnesses and diseases are doing to those communities with these newer illnesses being brought in, right? So without ever having been exposed to these different illnesses, they wreak havoc on a lot of these communities. And it's within a span of, from European arrival, there's about like 70, I've heard about 70 up to 90% of the North American, South American population just completely decimated to these newer diseases. Things like, of course, smallpox is a well-known one, but even things like cholera, typhoid, dysentery, things like that really go in and really wreak havoc on these communities. And it only appears to be that after an amount of time where people are starting to grow more accustomed to those things, do those illnesses tend to drop down. They don't disappear entirely, but what do you kind of say? I guess like the destruction, what those diseases are doing, tend to die down a little bit over time.
Rose would like to know, what was your day like?
Was my day like?
Yes.
Or
their day.
Oh, I was like, well, I'm trying to get the work done today. It's coming here and speaking to you folks. But Well, life in the 18th century, for a lot of these different American Indian communities, it kind of depends on the tribe, on their division of labor, who does what, who owns what different types of roles or functions they have within their community. That's really going to determine which each of these different tribes or citizens within those nations are going to be performing. So if you really think about like a lot of the main communities I speak on, of course, is going to be in regards to Cherokee folks. In the 18th century, life for Cherokee folks is pretty easy going. It was kind of remarked by some English folks who are going into Cherokee communities and making remarks on what they're seeing and what folks are doing. He's basically saying that they only do as much work as necessary, and then as soon as that's done, they continue on to whatever it is that they choose to do. That can involve dancing, sitting together and sharing stories, getting handiwork done, things like pottery and basket weaving. It usually tends to be, from what we see in a lot of the 18th century documents, is that a lot of the Cherokee women are performing the majority of the work that goes on within a community, whether that's from building houses, to taking care of the children, to looking after the gardens, making sure the communities are in order and clean and taken care of, watching after those kind of like family units. But speaking of division of labor, that means that because they do all of that work, they maintain ownership and autonomy over that work. It tends to be a lot of the work that's done outside of the community, things like hunting, going to war, diplomatic missions of sending emissaries here or there, tends to be more so done by the men. And so it's kind of what I mean by kind of the division of labor. It's depending on what you work on is going to be what you're owning. So my life in the 18th century, depending on what it is that I'm doing or what my station in the community might be, it's going to be pretty easy going for me. I might not have a whole lot to attend to, whereas folks like my wife or my mother or grandmother are going to be taking the majority of the work, but maintaining autonomy of all that work.
We've had two questions along the same lines. Would Native people ever use currency in the 18th century? Was there a medium of exchange barter? And another question just about commercial interactions, both amongst themselves as well as with white communities.
Okay. So a means of currency, again, to my knowledge, I'm not aware of any type of currency or hard currency specifically that they're using as a means to say this equals this amount of money or et cetera. But there is a system of trade and bartering. And to the value of those is going to be whatever those two individuals or communities are agreeing on what that value is. So when you talk about different communities in the 18th century or even prior to that, all these different tribes and these different nations that extended from down in like Central and South America and moving up in the different portions of the America and then on up into Canada, they are not, even though they have their own communities and their own territories and they're living and working within those communities, they are not separate of each other. They're traveling, they're exchanging goods, they're marrying between one another, they're having war and conflict, they're having diplomatic meetings and missions between one another, they're forging alliances, which means that they're, like I said, they're pretty interconnected. So if you think of a lot of the main roadways or things like that that are used today are built on old wagon paths. A lot of those old wagon paths are built on old trade paths that really connect those communities. And so we know that there are particular times of the year that were utilized for different communities or groups to come together specifically for the means of trade. So they're basically taking things that they might not have available to them in their region and bringing what they have to the table, and they're making kind of that exchange. But like I said, it's basically to the comfort of the individuals of what they're trading. So whenever they come in, what they're presenting, saying, I don't have those shells, but I have flint available to me, so I'll offer you some flint in exchange for these shells. That's an even trade. That's an even exchange. Things of food, houses. The funny thing is, though, when you talk about the kind of the exchange of goods, the idea of wagering those goods is very, very common. So Europeans remarked that these different tribes, not having too much of an attachment to material goods, are more than willing to wager or barter those things away as quickly as they can get them, in the hopes of getting other things, right? So we've even seen entire townships being wagered on games like stakeball, for example, on games of beans, games of chance.
And you speak of some of the things that Native peoples could be interested in? What were the things that they would want to have here from Williamsburg? What kind of goods were European goods were they looking to acquire?
Pretty much a lot of the tribes that we see who are involved in the fur trade, with a lot of English traders and French traders, etc., is anything they can get their hands on. So when we think about like metal tools, for instance, cooking implements, kettles made out of iron or brass or copper, things like that. Tin is very popular. Let's go back to the idea of the division of labor, right? So the tools on what somebody's going to be trading for is because they need it for either their use or for their comfort. So things like cooking implements, gardening implements, things like that. A lot of the women are going to be using those different things, right? Think about things like guns and weapons and ammunition, powder, things like that. A lot of the men are going to be using because it's going to be happening outside the community, right? But the biggest thing that everybody uses is clothes. So in the 18th century, the highest traded item that we see Native communities or American Indian communities looking for is textiles. There are some, we do know of some remnants of some types of cloth and textiles that are being made here in the Americas prior to European arrival, but we tend to see a really drastic dip in its production once European trade picks up, because you can kind of look at it like a time-saving effort. So making things like textiles is going to take you a while because you got to gather the materials, you got to prepare it, you got to dye it, and then when you're making the thing, a lot of the items that we see come in pre-European contact are not just utilitarian items; they are also fashionable items. So they're merging those two things of, if I got to use it, why can't it look nice, right? And so those things take a lot of time. But with European trade, you can think about like textiles. If I can sit here and it's going to take me so many hours or so many days or weeks to get this article done, if I can do away with that in an instant by having a couple furs exchanged off for the same yardage of cloth in an instant, it tends to become both a mixture of convenience and fashion. One, because of different types of textiles that are coming, like different types of colored wool, linen shirts, kerchiefs that are coming from all over the world, right? So you think of like pattern kerchiefs that are coming in from places like India, different types of wool coming from different places. England, Stroud cloth coming from Stroud, England. They're wanting those items for their own fashion, but also convenience. So what are you going to do if you can take away those weeks of labor in an instant? You're going to do whatever you want to do, right? You're going to spend that time however you like to spend it. But now you're also getting the items that you want to wear, things that you like. So when we think about folks coming here to Williamsburg and they say, well, how come you're wearing a mix of English clothing and American Indian clothing? Well, like Talon remarked in our blog post, it's really neither. It's American Indian fashion, right? So even though it's European textiles, we're wearing them in the sense that we like, whether it's appropriate for our community, just because we like the thing, especially things like trade silver, nice shiny trinkets. We know that like check pattern shirts, for instance, are very, very popular and fashionable within Cherokee communities in the 18th century. And I think an important thing to remark on too, especially when we're talking about trade, is a lot of these American Indian communities are pretty set on what they want, on what they like, because we're seeing that in the trade list of what's being requested. So with traders who are licensed by the different colonies that they're doing business on to engage in the fur trade, mind you, this isn't just an exchange of hands. This is a large part of the English economy in the 18th century, just as important in tobacco, just as important in gathering natural resources, which furs are. So there's a good mark on keeping good relations with the tribes that they know they can do business with, but also keeping those tribes happy in the articles and things that they're looking for and making sure they're providing the quality that they're wanting, the quality that they're asking for. And so we can even extend that not just from being the raw textiles to make their own clothing, but even ready-made shirts, shoes, hats, suits of clothing, silk garments. We've seen like other items, like fashionable items like burning glasses, spectacles or glasses. Those things are being requested to be sent out to those communities for their use too.
Will wants to know, how much studying do you have to do for your job as an interpreter here?
How much studying do we have to do? It's kind of a constant, really. So I don't think I've ever been at the point where I've said, okay, I know enough to talk on this particular thing, or I know enough that I can confidently speak on this. There's always this kind of like nagging feeling in the back of my head. Is like, I know enough to where I can say, as far as I understand, or the things that I've seen up until this point, is what I can tell you about. Because there are a lot of knowns and unknowns, especially when we talk about studying American Indian tribes and communities in the past. Because, of course, speaking on things that aren't recorded, documented history for the Americas, and written specifically, doesn't pick up until European arrival. So prior to that, a lot of these communities are solely based in oral history. The way that they educated their children is by sitting and talking with one another. Speaking about having to stay inside, for instance, during the wintertime, these communities are getting a little bit of the work that needs to get done, but much of that stuff has already been done from the spring, the summer, and the fall. So during the wintertime, they're really sitting inside and listening and speaking with one another, working on language, stories, on oral, or how do you kind of say, the ideals of oratory, being able to stand up in front of crowds and talk about different subjects in regards to religion and politics and etc. And so a lot of that important information that we have doesn't really come from me just sitting and studying and reading a book. That comes from reaching out to a lot of the communities that we're talking on. So sometimes if I find something from a primary source, from a primary document of somebody from the 18th century saying, I saw this Shawnee man do this, and here's what I think it means. I'm going to take that document and I'm going to reach out to some folks that I do know from some contemporary Shawnee communities, and I'm going to say, hey, this is what I saw. This is what I read. What do you think about that? Have you heard of anything similar? And coming down from their oral histories, there are some things that they're definitely going to be able to aware of. They're like, yes, I was actually told about that thing, or I've studied that particular thing myself. And so it's a very unique position to be in, to kind of find those physical documents of something that happened in the past, and then taking that standpoint and reaching out to the communities that they come from and kind of seeing the why, right? So we can see somebody say, I saw this thing, but not be able to explain the why. We can kind of take that to those different communities and get that why from their own mouths, from their own words. Because even though we are contemporary people, a lot of those things have been passed down through those different families and through those different communities that can kind of carry on. Mm-hmm.
So we have Jane, who wants to see your clothes and hair, and Patricia, who wants to an explanation for the meaning of the red paint, the black face paint. Mm-hmm. So maybe show off what you're wearing and some of the significance.
Sure. So basically, what I'm wearing is nothing too fanciful. I got on a linen check pattern trade shirt and nice silk scarf. Some trade beads, and then of course we're talking about I don't know if you can see that, but kind of the exchange of goods and talking about wool. So we got wool leggings and a wool breech cloud. Got some garters there to hold my legs up. Got some moccasins. From my hair, you can kind of see it's got this bit in the back, just my hair in the back there, and the rest is shaved off. That's for a particular reason. I'll explain it why here in just a second. But talking about the clothes, I'm kind of just wearing something if I'd come to the city. It's not terribly too fancy, but it's most definitely not dressed down. So when you think about the idea of today, you got clothes that you wear when you go to exercise. You got clothes that you wear when you go to a black tie event, for example. And then, of course, you got things that you wear when you're just hanging out at the house on your days off or something like that, right? Pretty much the same thing we did in the 18th century. So when you think about wearing wool, I'd press to ask you if you think wool's comfortable during the dead of the summer heat. Not very much. So in different communities, they're pretty much wearing just breech clout and moccasins. Women are wearing maybe a wrap skirt and a shirt because you're dressing for the weather, for the occasion. But when different delegations do come to Williamsburg, they're wearing a lot of their fineries. So they're wearing all the things that they find to be nice and fashionable for them. And they're really dressing it up for that very important event, a very important affair. The hairstyle is pretty indicative of a specific group of people. I guess the way that I explain it to people is kind of like a fraternity, you can kind of say. of which contemporarily I'm not a part of that fraternity. So I use it as a means of education and being able to talk about the folks in the 18th century and prior to that, those men who do go to war. So regionally, war and conflict is going to be different, right? So different tribes are going to war over different things. So if we think about folks like in the plains, who are following food sources that don't stay in the same place, they're going to inevitably traverse and travel into different communities, into different lands, and that might cause conflict over those different resources and things like that. When we think about war and conflict with a lot of southeastern and northeastern woodland tribes, talking about them needing everything they have or needing within their particular region doesn't necessarily constitute a need for war as a means of gaining resources or land or territory. As far as we can kind of see based on a lot of oral history and based on 18th century documents and means of conflict, wars between southeastern and northeastern tribes tended to be more of a challenge between individuals rather than political motives, religious motives, resources, etc. So it could be as simple to the fact that somebody says, I'm a young guy, I want to make a name for myself. And if I want the accolades like these men who are sitting right here who've been going to war and who do have stories to talk about them, I want that for myself. They got to go out and they got to achieve that for themselves. So war could basically be nothing more than a group of like-minded folks who say, I'm going to go start trouble with folks from a different community. So when they get out there, how do they identify one another, right? So a lot of these communities, for those men who engage in that lifestyle of war and conflict, might remove the hair from the top of their head and keep what they refer to as a scalp lock in the 18th century today. That kind of identifies them as one of those individuals, especially with tattoos and markings about the body or the face. That really identifies somebody of saying, if you're looking for a fight, I'm the person that you're looking for. I'm the one who's going to give you that challenge. And so that kind of keeps folks, non-combatants, out of the fray. So thinking about like women, children, elder folks, even entire villages or communities are usually outside the bounds of that fraternity. So usually wars and conflict don't touch anybody who's not about that mind. So the hairstyle and the paint at times can be a way of identifying who those men are that you're looking for that challenge from. The red ochre in going to war, those men might take that ochre and they'll rub it all about their bodies. Sometimes black paint, different communities use different colors. And individuals, of course, use different orientations of paint. Could be as unique as their tattoos, which is their personal identity and war records. But it's basically a way of identifying folks and what they're about. It was kind of said that in the 18th century too is the idea of that a lot of the wars and conflicts is a young man's game. And when they get kind of older and they choose to lay down those weapons, they become peace chiefs or advisors for their communities and those other young men. And so these folks are always kind of moving through stages of life. So just because somebody might be tattooed and marked up and things like that might not necessarily mean they're about that life. They moved into a different phase of their life, a different phase in their time. Women were also known to use red ochre in much the same fashion I'm wearing now. So of course, where I'm kind of dressed up, I'm not going to war. I'm not a warrior. I'm not ready to fight or anything like that. But this is a way of kind of dressing yourself up, right? Some folks will have different explanations as to what it's used, and I don't necessarily think that anyone is wrong because each of these different tribes and communities has their own purpose as to why they use this paint and how it's used and how it's adorned. But we do know that it's pretty common for a lot of southeastern and northeastern tribes and tidewater tribes here to use red ochre to adorn the body or the face or the head.
Michelle wants to know about holidays and ceremonies that were celebrated by your tribe, and Pam has a curiosity about art and music and how it relates both to daily life as well as celebrations.
Ooh, celebrations. All right, so we could celebrate just about near anything, quite honestly. So there are specific times throughout the year that are kind of utilized. So in thinking about like today, Cherokee folks, of course, or not just Cherokee folk, a lot of communities still use like the green corn festival. That's kind of when the corn begins to ripen, but it's not good for harvesting. That is an observance of a historical event. So historically, that was used as kind of like the new year. So it was said that during that time, any past offenses or debts or anything like that had to either be paid and settled or they had to be forgiven so you could move forward into the new year fresh. So that's kind of what we also use for keeping track of time. So times when it snows or times when certain things are good for harvesting, when certain types of animals are good for hunting, things like that. Those are all ways of keeping track of those times and those different phases and cycles of the year and of the society. Celebrations could be used coming back from war to kind of talk about the deeds that had been done and the different events that had occurred. Celebrations could be used at treaty signings and engagements of when they come in to say, all right, we want to stop this conflict. We want to be coming back together as kin and as brothers the way we used to be. And so that could be used as a way to celebrate those new partnerships, those new ties and chains of friendship. And that's done with both different other American Indian communities as well as European societies. So we do know that there are European folks who witness these events, who are part of those events when they happen. But song and dance is basically what we love to do when we're not working or doing anything else, quite honestly. So a lot of these dances don't even have to be ceremonial or very spiritually charged. A lot of these dances could also be done for the means of coming together and enjoying each other's company, just to come together and celebrate. So a lot of the social dances that we did too were used as a way to just come together and hang out with one another and laugh and eat and spend time together.
Robert says that he has heard of beloved women in some Native societies. Can you explain who these people are and their position in society?
Yes. So the term beloved woman, as far as I know, is specifically a Cherokee title, I guess you can kind of say. But the same premise of that position you can kind of find between other southeastern and northeastern woodland tribes. Basically, as best I can explain it to you, is a beloved woman in the 18th century is like the matriarch of an entire village or community. So where we talk about Cherokee society and other Southeastern Northeastern society being not matriarchal, but matrilineal. So the families and the kinship ties are only passed down through the women. So the way I can explain it to you is in the 18th century, only Cherokee women created Cherokee citizens. Cherokee men did not, because those children are always following down from the lineage of their mothers, never their fathers. So it's kind of like the idea of prior to marriage, a man's most important women in his life is going to be like his sisters, his aunties, his mothers, his grandmas. After marriage, that becomes his wife. He leaves and he goes to live with his wife and becomes part of her family. And those children remain from that marriage, belong to their mother within that particular clan. Now, there are also clan brothers who are like the heads of those entire clans within that specific community. So it's not like this one particular clan is only in this village. It's like within this village, all these different clans are represented. Those are basically your kinship ties, your family units. And so within that village, you'll have like your mothers or your grandmothers, your wives who are the heads of your specific household and your immediate family. Your clan brothers are the heads of your entire clan, your extended family unit, I guess you can kind of say. And then within a village, you have elected positions like beloved women, like peace chiefs, like war chiefs. And the beloved women are basically there to serve as the opposite voice to the men within those councils. So she is an advisor. Whereas like a peace chief advises during times of peace, war chiefs are responsible for advising during times of war and conflict. She kind of straddles both of those realms. And so it's kind of like adhering to the advice or the opinions of your mother or your wife, etc. So when you come into council, whenever she speaks, she's speaking from the mind of your mother, the mind of your sister, the mind of your aunties, your grandmothers, etc. And it's kind of to the effect of you have to consider both of those minds. So men who are part of that fraternity who like to go into war, you give them any opportunity to go, they'll go in an instant because they like to do it. That's just what they do. But that other mind of saying, hey, here's some things you need to consider. Can we carry out this campaign? Is it going to put your family in dire straits? Are they going to need you here for any particular reason before you men decide to go out and do the things that you do? So that's really what a beloved woman is. And when I talk about being elected, she is elected to that position by the entire community as a whole, all together. Because whatever opinion she puts forth, that's like saying, I choose to follow her because I trust her counsel. I trust her words. And so things like peace chiefs, war chiefs, and beloved women are not hereditary positions. They are all voted upon by a consensus. The difference between a peace chief and a war chief, though, where a peace chief can be reelected after a period of years, war chiefs are elected as often as necessary, but only by the men who go to war. That beloved woman, she'll maintain that position for the rest of her life. It's a very highly respected position. And those positions of like beloved women and beloved men are actually being utilized today. They are very highly respected elders within those communities that are put in by law, that we recognize these folks as being the ones who are going to help pass down these stories and this knowledge and this information, who are very active in the community. So it's a very important position historically and today, contemporarily.
Shelley would like to know, where are the Cherokee located today, and what does it mean to be a federally recognized tribe?
Oh, that's a very good question. So when we talk about federally recognized, a federally recognized tribe is basically a tribe that the United States recognizes as a sovereign nation within its borders, right? These are usually based upon old, long-standing treaties that have been put in place. Like if you think about Cherokee, for example, there are treaties that extend way back into English territory, and then after the Americas, there are treaties that are created and then made. Those are basically promises. Those are those ideas to say, here's how we as two different nations have agreed to work together. That's basically what a federally recognized tribe is. It's a tribe that has longstanding treaties and promises with the United States. And for specifically Cherokee folks, those three bands of Cherokee that exist is going to be the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, which is located in Cherokee, North Carolina, also known as the Paula Boundary. There's going to be the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and the United Gidua Band of Cherokee, which are the last two, the United Gidua Band and the Cherokee Nation, are both located in Oklahoma. How they end up out there in Oklahoma, as well as with a lot of other southeastern and northeastern woodland tribes, is of course due to what we know as the Trail of Tears. So it's the Indian Removal Act that placed some of those tribes out there. So they all stem and come from the same community. So originally Cherokee territory in the 18th century is relegated to about like Western Carolina, Eastern Tennessee, Northern Georgia. That makes up about the crux of Cherokee territory, with a large expanse of wilderness that is claimed as hunting grounds. And so they really come from the southeastern region. But it's not until the 1800s where a lot of these tribes are removed, to where some folks are able to stay for a number of different reasons, like the Eastern Band, and then everybody else being removed kind of out west to Oklahoma, which was slotted to be Indian territory. So even though they're recognized as three different tribes, they're the same. They come from the same people historically. Which are those communities that we kind of talk about in the 18th century as being Cherokee, coming from the middle towns in Western Carolina, the lower towns in Northern Georgia, and the overhill towns in Eastern Tennessee.
Will wants to know, what do you enjoy most about interpreting Native American history?
What I enjoy most interpreting about Native American history? Quite honestly, it's the idea of here's how I know I did a good job. This is like the baseline of how I used to be like, okay, that interpretation went good, or that was good interaction, is when somebody says, I didn't think of it like that, or I never thought of that before. Because what we're really doing is we're kind of stemming the tide of well over 400 or 500 years of misrepresentation for a lot of these American Indian communities. So when you think about like movies, TV, books, and the way that American Indian tribes and people are portrayed in the media, that didn't happen just in the 1900s, right? That started in the 1800s, which came from the 1700s, which came from the 1600s to the 1500s, etc. So whether they're writing about us in newspaper, in missives, somebody's writing their memoirs and remarking on what they saw these different tribes doing, that is an image of a representation of those communities. And so we are now, or have been, I've been doing this for the small period of time that I've been doing this for, I guess about 12 years. There are people who have been doing this much longer than I have, who are stemming the tide of that misrepresentation, and folks coming out and saying, here's some imagery I'd like to share with you, or here's some of the stories we'd like to share with you, or here's what our dances look like, or here's what our language sounds like, specifically from those communities. which kind of takes away that romanticized idea of what you see in different movies and films and TV. And they're really taking ownership of those narratives and what that means. And so I kind of look at what I'm doing as it's a drop in the bucket. And hopefully I'm adding towards that same narrative that all these other different communities are engaging in. And so if we can get folks to say, I didn't think of it like that, that means we've just taken all the things that they've been shown and given them the opportunity to interact with somebody who is kind of living within that life, within that world, a sneak peek, just a little bit sneak peek.
All right, so we're to the last one, and
Sure.
It's going to be a two-part. Matthew was hoping that you would be able to introduce yourself before you go in Cherokee, and then the actual question that I want to end is one from Sharisa. What are some of the appropriate things that non-native peoples can do to help preserve and honor these important cultures and traditions today? And Scott had something along similar lines. Or what are some of the things that we can do here at Colonial Williamsburg, what we can do in general to tell more of the story of the native peoples?
All right, so I'm actually going to take this in two parts. I'm going to do the first one, do the introduction, and then I'd like to go back to the next question. All right, and I'm going to preface this as I am still learning Cherokee, and it's a little hard for me being removed from my community, living up here in Williamsburg. So a lot of the language that I'm able to get is when I go back home. So you'll have to forgive me, but I'm gonna try it, and I'm gonna do my best. And for the speakers who are in the live feed, I ask your forgiveness. I'm still trying, but I'm gonna give it a go. So if I were to introduce myself in Cherokee within the language, I would say Shio or Shiwatu, Aya Gashalana Dagodo, Aya Ani Gaduogi Elwodi Again. So within that, what I said was, as best as I can attempt to say it, as I said, hello, I said, I hope you're doing, or I was asking if you're well. I told you about my name was Gashalana. That's what a lot of folks call me back home. Gashalana refers to like a blanket or a coat, anything you might use to keep yourself warm with. And then I said that I'm one of the men who come from my mother town called Gidua, which is right near present-day Cherokee, North Carolina. And then I told you that I come from the Yellow Hill community within Cherokee there. And so, like I said, I'm still learning. I'm still really taking those baby steps to try and get my footing within the language. And so for influence speakers, I, of course, wouldn't mind being corrected. We have some wonderful folks back home who are really driving that initiative of reviving the language and have done some great work. So I think it's really cool that a lot of our fluent speakers are some of our older generation, like a lot of our elders, but a lot of our fluent speakers now are very young children who are being put through the Kody Language Academy and things like that. They're on the Kuala boundary who are, fluent speakers. They're kids who just jabber on just in language themselves, and I think it's really neat to see that. But I'm playing catch up. I need to catch up to them.
And
the second part, yeah.
Oh, you again. I have to find it again. What are some of the appropriate things that non-native peoples can do to help preserve and honor these important cultures and traditions?
Well, that's a very good question. The best thing you can do is ask questions. When you see a movie, where did that come from? Why did they do those things? Where did they get that information? That's about the biggest thing that you can do to help, is to also further increase your knowledge and your information. A lot of the different tribes, like when we're talking about federally recognized communities, things like that, they all have their own websites where they share a lot of the information that they're willing to put out to the public. Like if you go to their different websites and organizations, you can see on there, they'll tell you a little bit about their history, what type of food they eat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can actually, you have the ability to go to the source of those different American Indian communities to kind of, for lack of a better term, get the information from a horse's mouth. So I think it's where I was kind of talking about, where I'm looking at those different historical records and things like that, that come from a means of asking why. Why did this happen? Where did this come from? Where did they get this idea? And then building on that alongside those oral histories. Because it's very important, again, to recognize the idea that American Indian communities are not people of the past. They are contemporary people. They live in the modern age, and they just so happen to be privy to the knowledge and the teachings that come from the folks who came before them, their grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents. And so it's very important to also ask and sit down over a cup of coffee and have kind of those discussions and speak with one another. And so, I mean, how do you learn about anybody else, right? Just sit down and speaking with them, sit down and talking with them. I always say, who's the best person to tell your life story, right? It's going to be you. So go to those communities, go to those folks and ask them what that life story is. All right. So other than that, I guess we're coming on to the end here. So I'd like to thank you and for joining me for my first live feed. So I hope y'all enjoyed it. And it was my pleasure being able to sit and answer your questions. And I really appreciate you taking the time and to ask those questions. So other than that, thank you very much. Y'all enjoy the rest of your day.